I want to just begin. There's so much we can talk about with Catherine the Great. So I just want to begin and give you some background about how she even came to Russia. Princess Catherine. You don't need to take notes on this. Just listen to this fascinating character. Okay? Over in Russia, the Empress Catherine the Great watched in horror as king and aristocrats died by the guillotine. Okay? We know that the French Revolution is going on over in France. Catherine the Great had come to the throne of Russia 30 years before. Like Peter the Great, who ruled before her, Catherine admired Western ideas, but she was still firmly convinced that kings ruled because God gave them power. France, she told one of her ministers, was going to ruin. Catherine may have believed that God gave kings and empresses their power, but the empress herself had come to the throne by very human means. Catherine wasn't even Russian. Her father had been the prince of a little German state, and her mother was Swedish. But her mother's cousin had married the daughter of the great Russian Emperor Peter the Great, and their son, Peter Ulrich, had been declared the heir. The Empress Elizabeth, Peter Ulrich's aunt, had seized the Russian throne years before, and she thought that young Catherine would be the perfect wife for her nephew. When Catherine was 15, the Empress sent a message to Germany, inviting the young princess to come and visit Russia. Catherine's mother, Joanna, was thrilled. If her daughter married the future Tsar, she would be the mother of a queen. But Catherine's father shook his head in worry. "You will have to become a member of the Russian Orthodox Church," he warned Catherine. "We have always been followers of Martin Luther's teachings, and you must promise me to never leave the Lutheran Church." Catherine promised. She wasn't sure she wanted to marry Peter anyway. She had met him once before when he was 10. She remembered an odd, small, white-faced boy, bad-tempered, and full of strange twitches. Even though he was only 10, he drank so much wine at dinner that he had to be carried away from the table. He had been unfriendly and rude to his servants and seemed to want only to play toy soldiers with one of his attendants. But the thought of a crown fascinated Catherine. And what was Peter like now that he was older? Catherine was willing to go and see. So she packed her clothes and with her mother set off for Russia's capital city of St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg was almost 1,000 miles away, and the road lay through the coldest, bleakest part of Europe. They traveled for 6 weeks. The roads disappeared under snow and ice and mud. They had to sleep at country inns where the guests piled together for warmth, while dogs and chickens nosed around the straw-strewn floors. Catherine's hands and feet swelled from frostbite. But when they finally arrived in St. Petersburg, they were welcomed with warm cloaks and celebration. The Empress's fur-lined sled was waiting to whisk them to Moscow, where Peter was waiting. Finally, Catherine arrived at the enormous candlelit mansion where Peter stood in the front hall to welcome her. He was much taller and more handsome than when she had seen him last, and he was delighted to see her. "I wish I could have harnessed myself to your sled so that you would have been here sooner," he explained. But the more time Catherine spent with Peter, the less she liked him. He was rude to his servants and courtiers. When he went to church, he made unpleasant noises and told loud jokes during the service. Even though he would rule Russia one day, he refused to speak Russian. Instead, he spoke German and told the Russians around him that he wished he could live in Prussia, a German state that Russians hated. But everyone around her seemed to expect her to marry Peter. The Empress Elizabeth was a big, frightening woman who flew into terrifying rages at her servants, and Catherine was afraid to tell her that she didn't like Peter. She tried to tell her mother, but Joanna was looking forward to becoming the mother-in-law of a Tsar. She scoffed at Catherine's doubts. Catherine's father would have agreed with her, but he was 1,000 miles away. Too afraid to refuse, Catherine agreed to convert to the Russian Orthodox Church and to be betrothed to Peter. The two went through a long, elaborate engagement ceremony. Catherine was given the title of a Russian Grand Duchess. Suddenly, everyone had to kneel in front of her, call her Your Imperial Highness, and kiss her hand. 4 months after the engagement ceremony, Peter came down with smallpox. Instantly, Catherine was whisked away to a distant palace so she wouldn't catch the disease too. And in those days, smallpox killed millions. Peter grew sicker and sicker. Smallpox sores covered his face and body. He wasn't expected to live, but he survived. When Catherine saw him again, she gasped in horror. His face was swollen. His skin was a mass of scars. He was barely recognizable. He had become hideous, Catherine wrote in her diary, and my blood ran cold at the sight of him. And just at this time, the Empress Elizabeth announced that it was time to set the date for the wedding. Catherine dreaded the day of the ceremony, but she was afraid to break off her engagement. So the two were married in an enormous celebration that the Empress had planned for months. Ambassadors from all over Europe was there. The feasting went on for hours. Catherine was the wife of the future Tsar, and she was miserable. Peter didn't improve after marriage. As a matter of fact, his behavior grew so strange that the Russian court whispered, "He's going mad." His scars covered a face that was always grimacing and twitching. He talked loudly in church, insulted visiting ambassadors, and giggled uncontrollably at serious occasions. He liked to pour wine on the heads of his servants and play with his wooden soldiers, and he ignored his wife. Catherine had no friends, and her mother Joanna had returned home after the wedding. She spent 9 lonely years reading books of history and philosophy, books about military tactics, books about the emperors of Rome and their strategies for ruling their empire. She made friends with the army officers. She rode through the streets of St. Petersburg and heard the Russian people murmur about her beauty. Next to weak, spindly, repulsive Peter, Catherine looked like a true queen. Catherine's life at court grew lonelier and harder. Peter insulted her in public and threatened to send her into exile. When Catherine had her first baby, after being married to Peter for 9 years, the Empress Elizabeth took the baby as soon as it was born and swept out of the room, commanding everyone to follow her. Catherine was left alone, exhausted and cold. No one even brought her a drink of water for 3 hours. The Empress had decided to raise the future heir to the throne herself. She named the little boy Paul and put his cradle in her own room. Catherine didn't even see her baby for 6 weeks. Catherine was furious, but lying in her bed, she began to think. The Empress Elizabeth was growing older and sicker. Peter was a fool and a madman. She was the mother to the heir of the throne. She was a strong, intelligent woman. The Russian people liked her. The army respected her. When the Empress Elizabeth died, why shouldn't Catherine rule in place of her bad-tempered, childish husband? When she was well again, Catherine began to make her plans. She reread her books about the Roman emperors and the way they controlled their people. She spent hours talking to the Empress's officials. They were impressed by her intelligence and her understanding of the affairs of state. Meanwhile, Peter drank more than ever. He staggered through the palace, screaming at the top of his lungs, beating his dogs and sometimes his servants in uncontrollable rages. The old empress began to grow weaker. In December of 1761, 16 years after Catherine's wedding, she took to her bed. Soon she was unable to move. She summoned Peter to her bedside. "Rule Russia well," she whispered. "Be kind to your servants. Watch over your son." Her eyes closed, but she still breathed. The whole court waited for days while the old woman lay motionless. Finally, on Christmas Day, the Empress died. Peter had become Tsar Peter III of Russia. Catherine did nothing. She was expecting another baby, and she was too tired and weak to lead a revolt. But she had waited 16 years in this cold, strange country. She could wait a little bit longer. The Empress Elizabeth's body was dressed in silver lace and a golden crown and taken to St. Petersburg's largest cathedral. For 6 weeks, services were held to mourn the Empress's death. By the end of the 6 weeks, the body smelled terrible. But Catherine pretended not to notice. She went to the cathedral every day. She wanted all of St. Petersburg to see how faithful and devout she was. Meanwhile, the new Tsar didn't even bother to weep for his mother. He threw huge feasts and told the court not to wear mourning clothes. When he visited the Empress's body in the cathedral, he told jokes and laughed loudly. Now that Peter was in charge of the army, he announced that the soldiers would have to become more like the Prussian soldiers. Peter had always loved the Prussian army, but the Russian soldiers had fought against the Prussian army for years, and they hated Prussians. Peter didn't care. He declared that the Russians would have to get rid of their uniforms and dress like Prussian soldiers. He planned to teach them to march and fight like Prussians. The soldiers were indignant. Many of them began to whisper that Catherine, who had often visited them in their army barracks, would make a better ruler than her husband. By the time Catherine had her second baby, the army was almost ready to rebel against Peter. They hated their new uniforms and the new Prussian customs, and Peter had just ordered them to do something loathsome. He needed money for the royal treasury, so he sent the army out to seize the land owned by the Russian Orthodox Church. He planned to sell this land and keep the money. Church leaders protested. The church had owned this land for hundreds of years, but Peter refused to listen. He ordered the soldiers to search Orthodox monasteries for treasure, even inside the monks' rooms, and take everything that they found. Many of these soldiers were devout Orthodox Christians. They obeyed the Tsar, but they hated carrying out his commands. Meanwhile, Catherine was recovering from the birth of her baby. In just a few weeks, she attended her first public banquet. Hundreds of guests, army officers, ambassadors from France and Prussia, state ministers sat at long tables glittering with silverware and golden dishes. Peter sat on a raised dais drinking wine. He grew drunker, louder, and wilder as the night went on. At the end of the banquet, Peter lurched to his feet and screamed at Catherine, "Fool! Idiot! If I want to, I can throw you in prison for the rest of your life." Peter had finally gone too far. The army loved Catherine and hated their Tsar. The word spread through the army, it is time to put the Empress on the throne. On the morning of June 28, 1762, Catherine got up early and dressed like an empress. Peter was away from St. Petersburg, staying at another town. The soldiers planned to surround the town so that the Tsar could not send for help, and then proclaim Catherine empress. When Catherine was dressed, she went to the barracks of the soldiers and told them that she was afraid Peter would arrest her and send her into exile. Most of them knelt to kiss her hands. A few yelled, "Paul! Paul!" The Tsar should be replaced by his son, not his wife. But the rest of the army followed Catherine through the streets of St. Petersburg, shouting, "Vivat! Vivat!" meaning long live the new empress. Catherine went to the Cathedral of St. Petersburg and asked the head priest of Petersburg to bless her. The Metropolitan, the head priest of Petersburg, hated what Peter had done to the Russian Orthodox Church. He prayed over Catherine and pronounced her empress, and all over St. Petersburg church bells rang. The people of St. Petersburg poured out of their houses to find out what was happening. Most were glad to hear that they were no longer ruled by the unpredictable savage Peter. In the meantime, the Tsar found himself surrounded. He tried to rally the army to his side, but as the day went on, Peter saw that the soldiers were no longer loyal to him. He spent the whole night drinking. By morning, he had realized that his throne was lost. He signed a paper agreeing to give up his throne and sent Catherine a letter. "Let me leave Russia," the letter begged, "to go live in Prussia, a country I have always loved." But Catherine knew that if Peter went to Prussia, he might be able to convince the Prussians to invade Russia and help him take his throne back. So she ordered her allies to take Peter to one of his palaces and guard him there. Just a week after Catherine became Empress of Russia, she received a scribbled note from one of the officers who was watching over Peter. "He is no longer in the world," the letter began. "He started a quarrel with Prince Beretansky at dinner, and before we could separate them, he was dead." The ex-Tsar had been murdered. His guards claimed that Peter had started a fight with Prince Beretansky, one of the noblemen Catherine had sent to watch over him. The two had struggled, and an accidental blow had killed Peter. Catherine issued a proclamation to the people of St. Petersburg announcing that the emperor had died suddenly of a stomach upset. "This is the will of God," the proclamation read. "The body will lie in state so that the people can pay their respects. Thousands of people traveled to see Peter's body, but as they began to file by, loud gasps of horror rose into the air. Peter's face was purple. The body had a large cravat wrapped around its throat so that no one could see it. The emperor had obviously been strangled. Strangled? The guards claimed he had died in a sudden fight. What had really happened? Had Catherine ordered her husband killed? Had she simply mentioned how good it would be if Peter were dead, so that her guards would act on her hint? No one knew, and Catherine never spoke of her husband's death afterwards. Many Russians noticed that she didn't punish anyone. Now Catherine was Empress of all Russia. For the next 30 years, she would rule over her adopted country with as much energy as Peter the Great himself. She worked 15 hours every day to make Russia stronger and bigger. Under her reign, Russia's borders expanded. The Russian army claimed the land of Alaska, north of Canada, took land away from the Turks and Mongols, and seized part of Poland. Think about that background as you read about what she does during her reign and modernizing Russia. You're going to learn about some of the great things that she accomplished. Again, I want you to compare them with what Queen Victoria did. But there were some negative aspects to her reign as well. Okay? Let me just continue with this one last page. Like Peter the Great, Catherine liked many of the ideas of the West. She admired the French philosopher Voltaire, who wrote about equality and liberty, and she wrote him many letters. She brought many Western customs to Russia. She rewrote Russia's confusing ancient laws so that her people would have more rights. She told her ministers of state that no one could be tortured for information. She opened new schools and started the first college for Russian women. She even made a woman the director of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Catherine opened new hospitals and brought in doctors from the West to improve the health of the Russian people, and Catherine's people began calling her Catherine the Great. But although Catherine liked to think of herself as a modern, enlightened empress, she didn't want the people of Russia to have the same rights as citizens of the United States or of France. For Catherine, equality meant that all Russians had to obey the same laws. But the empress still got to make those laws, and she didn't have to ask anyone's permission. Catherine kept a close eye on her court during the French Revolution, looking for signs that the French infection had spread to Russia. And she didn't hesitate to get rid of anyone she thought might be a threat to her power. One French philosopher invited to visit Catherine's court refused with the words, "I am not anxious to go to a country where people are apt to die so suddenly." By the end of Catherine's reign, Russia was a strong and wealthy empire. But Catherine had given her noblemen even more power over the peasants and serfs who lived on their land, and these poor Russians had grown hungrier and more ragged than ever before. The French infection had not brought liberty and equality to Russia. Fascinating, fascinating empress. I hope you enjoyed her story.